Welcome to this video on the theory of the Riemann integral and the fundamental theorem of calculus. Here we give an exposition of the theory of integration as given by Bernard Riemann in the 19th century. I hope you'll enjoy how one is able to, seemingly from very simple first principles, prove some very strong and surprising facts about integration and succession. The table of contents here gives you an understanding of the structure of this lecture. We start first with the concept of upper and lower sums of functions that are computed with respect to dissections of the interval AB. All will be made clear as we start providing the necessary definitions. Then we use upper and lower sums to give a formal definition of Riemann integrability of a function f. After that, we use a lemma to make statements about which functions are subsets of the set of all integrable functions. Following that, we establish some of the rules of integration such as additivity, monotonicity, and linearity. The lecture ultimately ends with a presentation of the fundamental theorem of calculus. To begin, we mentioned that the concept of the Riemann integral is concerned with the integration of bounded functions f on a closed bounded interval of the form AB. The supremum of a non-empty set of real numbers is defined to be the least upper bound of that set and is denoted sup A. Likewise, the infimum is defined to be the greatest lower bound and is denoted inf A. The axiom of completeness states that if A is a non-empty set and bounded above, then its supremum exists in R. From this, it can be shown that if A is non-empty and bounded below, then its infimum exists in R as well. The definition of a dissection is now presented. A dissection D of the interval AB is a subset of the interval containing a finite number of points, including the two endpoints. It is the form x0, x1, and so on all the way up to xn. Also, we let calligraphic D of AB denote the set of all dissections of the interval AB. If f is a function with associated dissection D, then we write capital Ti for the supremum of the image of f over each subinterval x sub I minus 1, xi, and little ti for the infimum of the image of f over each subinterval. This holds for indices I equals 1, 2 all the way up to n. Following this, the upper sum of f with respect to D is defined as the sum from I equals 1 to n of the quantity capital Ti times xi minus 1. In a similar manner, the lower sum is defined as the sum of the quantity little ti times xi minus 1. The sums are well defined since f is a bounded function and all the suprema and infima exist in R. The first lemma we give is that for all dissections D, Lf, D is less than or equal to Uf, D. For the proof, let D be the dissection of interest. We know that little ti is less than or equal to capital Ti for all I. So Lf, D, which equals the sum of little ti times xi minus 1, is less than the sum of capital Ti times xi minus 1. The second quantity is Uf, D by definition. Using the lemma just established, we now give a theorem. If the set U is defined to be the collection of all upper sums as D ranges through all dissections, and L is defined to be the collection of all lower sums, then supremum of L and the infimum of U exist in R. For the proof, let capital T be the supremum of f over the interval AB and little t be the infimum of f over AB. It follows that T is greater than or equal to the supremum of f over each subinterval, and so for all I. Capital T is greater than or equal to capital Ti. Likewise, little t is less than or equal to little ti for all I, which is the infimum of f over each subinterval. So for all d, Uf, D equals the sum of capital Ti times xi minus 1. But this is in turn less than or equal to the sum of capital T times xi minus 1. The t is then factored out as it is independent of the index I, and the sum simplifies to the length of the interval AB due to its telescopic nature. Very similarly, Lf, D is defined to be the sum of little ti times xi minus 1. This is bounded below by the sum of little t times xi minus 1. On pulling out the little t, we see that again the sum simplifies to b minus a as in the previous case. So LF comma D is greater than or equal to little t times b minus a. We have now shown the following two inequalities to be true. Note that capital T times b minus a and little t times b minus a are fixed real numbers. In addition, for a particular dissection D, LF comma D is less than or equal to UF comma D. So on combining the inequalities, we obtain little t times b minus a is less than or equal to LF comma D, which is less than or equal to UF comma D, which is in turn less than or equal to capital T times b minus a, and this holds for all dissections D. Thus U is bounded below and the infimum of U exists in R. Also, L is bounded above and so has a supremum in R. The previous theorem enables us to set up the following notation. The upper integral with the bar on top is defined to be the infimum of the collection of all upper sums, and the lower integral with the bar underneath is defined to be the supremum of the set of all lower sums. We now enter a second section on Riemann integrability. A bounded function f from a closed bounded domain of the form ab to R is said to be Riemann integrable if the upper and lower integrals of f are equal to each other. In this case, the two quantities are said to be the integral of f. To show that f is Riemann integrable, we write f lies in calligraphic R of ab, where the calligraphic R stands for the class of all Riemann integrable functions. The next lemma we prove is that every upper sum exceeds every lower sum, even if the two dissections fail to be identical. So let d1 and d2 be two arbitrary dissections of AB, then capital U of f d1 is greater than or equal to capital L of f d2 always holds. In the proof of the lemma, we need to leverage some terminology that we introduce now. Let d and d prime be two dissections of AB. Then d prime is said to be a refinement of d if d is a subset of d prime. So d prime contains the same points as d as well as some finite number of additional ones that also lie in AB. We start things off with a proposition. Let d be a dissection of AB and choose y in AB not in D. Set d prime equal to the refinement of D formed by adding y to the set. Then U of D prime is less than or equal to U of D and L of D prime is greater than or equal to L of D. In other words, adding a point to a dissection decreases upper sums and increases lower sums. For the proof, we can assume without loss of generality that y lies in some subinterval x sub I minus 1 to x sub I. Therefore, only the contribution to the upper and lower sums from each of these subintervals is altered, while all the rest are unchanged. Set capital Ri to be the supremum of f over the interval x sub I minus 1 to y, and capital Si equal to the supremum of f over the interval y to x sub I. It is evident that capital T sub I is greater than or equal to capital R sub I and capital S sub I. For the contribution of the interval x sub I minus 1 to x sub I to the upper sum U of D prime, we have Ri times y minus x sub I minus 1 plus Si times x sub I minus y. This is less than capital Ti times y minus x sub I minus 1 plus capital Ti times x sub I minus y, which equals capital Ti times x sub I minus x sub I minus 1, found by factoring out the capital Ti and cancelling the y. But capital Ti times x sub I minus x sub I minus 1 is the contribution to the upper sum U of D of the same interval x sub I minus 1 to x sub I, from which it follows that U of D prime is less than or equal to U of D, as all the other contributions are identical. The proof regarding the corresponding inequality for L of D prime is similar. Lemma 13 makes use of proposition 12. Let D prime be a general refinement of D. Then U of D prime is less than or equal to U of D and L of D prime is greater than or equal to L of D. The proof follows by induction. We only prove the case of U of D prime and the second case proceeds by analogy. Let the cardinality of the set D prime minus D be denoted by M. Induction is carried out on M. Proposition 12 proved the case for m equals 1. So suppose the lemma is true for m equals k greater than or equal to 1. We show that it holds for m equals k plus 1 as well. Let d prime have exactly k plus 1 additional points and choose y in d prime minus d. This is possible since k plus 1 is greater than or equal to 2. On choosing y, set d naught equal to d prime minus y. It follows that d prime is a refinement of d naught formed by the addition of exactly one more point. So the previous proposition implies that u of d prime is less than or equal to u of d naught. But by the inductive hypothesis, u of d naught is less than or equal to u of d. Since d naught is a refinement of d with exactly k additional points, and the proof is done. The next proposition states that if d1 and d2 are two arbitrary dissections of AB, then d1 union d2 is a common refinement of d1 and d2. To prove this, note that d1 union d2 contains the endpoints a and b and is finite at the same time. Moreover, both d1 and d2 are subsets of the union of d1 and d2. On this slide, we recall lemma 10, which states that every upper sum is greater than or equal to every lower sum, even if the corresponding dissections do not match. For the proof, consider the dissection d1 union d2, a common refinement of d1 and d2. So combining proposition 14 and lemma 6, we get u of d1 is greater than or equal to u of d1 union d2, which is greater than or equal to LF d1 union d2, which is greater than or equal to LF d2, completing the proof. Now lemma 10 enables us to establish theorem 15, namely, for every bounded function f, the upper integral is no lesser than the lower integral. For the proof, take arbitrary d1 and d2 in calligraphic d of ab and fix d2 first. It is known that u of d1 is greater than or equal to L of d2, leading to the conclusion that L of d2 is a lower bound for the collection of upper sums, capital U. Hence L of d2 is also a lower bound for the infimum of u, which is the upper integral by definition. But now, the same argument can be turned on its head. Allowing d2 to vary now, we observe that the upper integral is an upper bound for the set capital L, which is the collection of lower sums. This is since the inequality LF d2 less than or equal to the upper integral holds no matter what d2 is chosen to begin with. Hence the upper integral must also be no lesser than the supremum of the set L, which is by definition the lower integral, thus establishing the desired inequality and proving theorem 15 in the process. Now we enter section 3 on sets of integrable functions. To start the section off, we have a simple yet useful proposition. If zeta is a non-negative number that is known to be strictly less than every real positive number, then it follows that zeta is identically 0. This ties into lemma 17 that sets up an equivalent criterion to tell exactly when a function is Riemann integrable. In particular, f is Riemann integrable if and only if, for all positive epsilon, there exists a dissection of AB such that the difference between the upper and lower sums of f with respect to d is less than epsilon. We start by proving the forward direction. So let epsilon positive be given and suppose that f is Riemann integrable. Then by definition, the upper and lower integrals are equal to each other and are simply defined to be the integral of f. Moreover, as the integral is the infimum of the lower sums, there exists a d1 such that u of d1 is less than the integral of f plus epsilon on 2. The quantity on the right is greater than the integral and hence fails to be a lower bound for the collection of upper sums. Likewise, there exists d2 such that L of d2 is greater than the integral of f minus epsilon on 2 for a very similar reason. Now set d to be the union of d1 and d2. Recall that it is a common refinement of both d1 and d2, so it follows that u of d is less than or equal to u of d1 and L of d is greater than or equal to L of d2 because of the effect that refinements have on upper and lower sums. Finally, the difference between the upper and lower sums taken with respect to d is less than or equal to u of d1 minus L of d2, which in turn is strictly less than the integral of f plus epsilon over 2 minus the integral of f minus epsilon over 2, which simplifies to epsilon. Thus u of d minus L of d can always be bounded above by every positive real number, and thus f is Riemann integrable. For the converse, suppose that for all positive epsilon one can find a dissection of AB such that u of d minus L of d is less than epsilon. We know that whenever the difference between the upper and lower sums for a given dissection is given, the upper and lower integrals is even lesser and is always non-negative, as we found out in theorem 15. So the inequality shown above holds for all d in d of AB. In particular, it holds when d is chosen so that u of d minus L of d is less than epsilon. This induces the same inequality and the difference between the upper and lower integrals of f by virtue of inclusion from the first inequality. And since this inequality can be achieved for every positive epsilon, it follows that the upper and lower integrals are in fact equal, using proposition 16 at the start of this section. Thus f is Riemann integrable. For a change of pace, we turn to an example. Define the function f from the unit interval 0, 1 to r by the relation f of 1 over n equals negative 1 to the power n and f of x equals 0 otherwise. We will show that f is Riemann integrable. So let capital N be a large natural number and form the dissection d sub capital N containing 0 and the reciprocals of the first capital N naturals. Then for this dissection, capital T1 is 1 and little t1 is negative 1. This is since the function f attains both the values 1 and negative 1 over the open interval 0 to 1 upon n. On the other hand, for I greater than or equal to 2, capital Ti is 0 and so is little ti. For I greater than or equal to 2, one needs to consider the image of f over the open interval between the reciprocals of two naturals. To be more specific, it is between the reciprocal of n plus 2 minus I and n plus 1 minus I. Notice how the second value has the smaller denominator and thus corresponds to the right endpoint. But on each of these open intervals, there does not exist any real number that is the reciprocal of a natural, because the reciprocals of two consecutive naturals form the endpoints. Thus on each open subinterval, the function is constantly 0, and hence we obtain the suprema and infima of 0. So using this dissection d sub capital N, the difference u of f dn minus L of f dn, which is the sum of the quantity capital Ti minus little ti times delta xi, the length of each subinterval. But it was noted on the previous slide that all the terms corresponding to I greater than or equal to 2 vanish and only the term from I equals 1 has a non-zero value. More precisely, delta x1 equals 1 upon capital N, and so the first term simplifies to capital T1 minus little t1 upon n. Now the difference capital T1 minus little t1 is 1 minus negative 1, that is 2. Finally, we recall that since n was not fixed, we are free to assign it any value we wish, depending on our needs. To that end, we choose n greater than 2 upon epsilon. In so doing, the difference between upper and lower sums, which is 2 upon capital N, is now less than epsilon, and we conclude that f is Riemann integrable. With this example out of the way, we now turn to the task of saying something about the class of integrable functions. First, we recall the definition of a monotonic function. A function f is monotonic increasing if x less than y implies that f of x is less than or equal to f of y. An analogous definition holds for monoton decreasing functions, with the inequality in the opposite direction. If a function is either monoton increasing or monoton decreasing, then it is simply referred to as monotonic. With the definition of a monoton increasing function or a monoton decreasing function, we come to theorem 20. It states simply that every monoton function is integrable. Or put in terms of the notion of sets, monoton functions form a subclass of all the integrable functions. To be more pedantic, the function needs not only be monoton, but must imperatively be defined on a closed bounded interval. Once this condition is met, integrability holds in the same interval. Segueing into the proof, we form the uniform dissection of AB of n subintervals. We only prove the case for monoton increasing functions. Place L equal to b minus a. The d sub n is defined as the dissection containing n plus 1 equally spaced points along the interval AB. By construction, the length of each subinterval is L upon n. By hypothesis, f is monotone increasing, and hence the infimum of f over each subinterval is lower bounded by f of x sub I minus 1, and the supremum is upper bounded by f of x sub I, this being true for all indices I. So the upper sum is less than or equal to b minus a upon n times the sum of f of xi, and the lower sum is greater than or equal to b minus a upon n times the sum of f of x sub I minus 1. Notice how the sum in u of f dn is staggered one place ahead of the sum in L of f dn. This fact is exploited further down in the proof by considering the difference between the upper and lower sums. Computing this difference and factoring out the term b minus a upon n, we see that the upper sum is b minus a upon n times the sum f of xi minus f of x sub I minus 1. The terms inside the sum are telescoping in nature. As is the case with telescoping sums, the chain of positive and negative terms causes all but the two end terms to get cancelled with each other. What remains is the expression f of b minus f of a. So it follows that u f dn minus L f dn is less than or equal to b minus a times f of b minus f of a all over n. At this point, we introduce a limiting argument by choosing n greater than epsilon over b minus a times f of b minus f of a. With n having been chosen in this way, the difference between the upper and lower sums comes out to be strictly less than epsilon, forcing us to conclude that f is Riemann integrable, as the inequality can be achieved for all positive epsilon. Now the next theorem increases our repertoire of functions that we know to be integrable. First, we saw that monotone functions were integrable. Now continuous functions are added to this list as well, with the caveat that the domain of definition is closed and bounded. To prepare the way for the proof, we first note that if f from AB to R is continuous, then it is uniformly continuous. What is vital to this theorem is that the domain is closed and bounded. Such domains are referred to as compact. With this theorem in hand, we now prove theorem 21. Since f is uniformly continuous, we can choose a positive delta such that mod x minus y is less than delta. Then mod f of x minus f of y is less than epsilon upon 3 times b minus a, whenever x and y are in the domain AB. Furthermore, the Archimedean property allows us to choose a natural greater than b minus a upon delta. With this n, we once again form the uniform dissection d sub n of n plus 1 equally spaced points. Here as before, L equals b minus a. Now in each subinterval x sub I minus 1 to x sub I, we can choose x and y such that f of x is greater than capital Ti minus epsilon upon 3b minus a, and f of y is less than little ti plus epsilon on 3b minus a. This is by virtue of the fact that capital Ti is the least upper bound and little ti is the greatest lower bound respectively. With x and y chosen in this way, the gap between capital and little ti can be written as capital Ti minus f of x plus f of x minus f of y plus f of y minus little ti. We then use the modulus to bound the central two terms f of x minus f of y. Now each of the three sets of terms capital Ti minus f of x, mod f of x minus f of y, and f of y minus little ti are less than the quantity epsilon over 3b minus a. Adding these three gives a strict upper bound for the difference capital Ti minus little ti, namely epsilon over b minus a. Remember that x and y were chosen so that mod x minus y was strictly less than L upon n, or in other words, b minus a upon n, which in turn was less than delta, implying that the modulus of the gap between the images of x and y was less than epsilon over 3b minus a. So using this particular uniform dissection d sub n, we obtain u f dn minus L f dn equals the sum of the terms capital Ti minus little ti times the length of each subinterval x sub I minus x sub I minus 1. Again, the terms inside the sum telescope and evaluate out to b minus a, cancelling out the factor of b minus a in the denominator. The final result is that u f dn minus L f dn is less than epsilon, and from lemma 17 we conclude that f is Riemann integrable. And with that, we come to the end of section 3 on sets of integrable functions. Section 4 now has as its focus rules concerning integration and how the concept of Riemann sums enables us to establish them. We make a start with theorem 23, commonly referred to as additivity. Informally, it is the property that allows one to decompose an integral into the sum of two integrals over two separate but perhaps connected intervals. Here is its statement. Take C in the open interval AB, then f is Riemann integrable on AB if and only if the restrictions of f to the intervals AC and CB are separately and simultaneously Riemann integrable. Furthermore, if any one of the conditions are met, then the integral of f over AB is precisely the sum of the integrals of f over the intervals AC and CB. We start by proving the necessary condition for f to be Riemann integrable on AB. If f is Riemann integrable on AB, then it follows from lemma 17 that there exists a dissection of AB D such that when the difference between the upper and lower Riemann sums of f with respect to the dissection D is computed, the value is strictly less than epsilon, where epsilon is a positive real number. Additionally, we can also assume that C is a member of the chosen dissection, for if not, then we simply adjoin the singleton C to the dissection and the refinement of D hence formed will also satisfy the epsilon inequality as before. Proceeding, we select out the first m points of the dissection D up to the point C and call the new set D1, noticing that in the process we have obtained a dissection of the interval AC. This is the dissection of AC induced by D, the dissection of AB. With the dissection D1, we compute the difference between the upper and lower sums of f on the interval AC. By definition, this is the sum from I equals 1 to m of the terms capital Ti minus little ti times x sub I minus x sub I minus 1. By running the sum all the way up to the index n, the sum can potentially be made larger. But the sum of capital Ti minus little ti times x sub I minus x sub I minus 1 from I equals 1 to n is, by very definition, UFD minus LFD. But this time the sums are computed over the interval AB as opposed to any of the two subintervals. By the way the dissection D was chosen, UFD minus LFD was less than epsilon, and the first inequality symbol has the effect of including the difference UFDN minus LFDN into the same bound with epsilon, meaning that f is Riemann integrable on AC. In much the same way, it is shown that f is also Riemann integrable on CB. In the subsequent part of the proof, we establish the sufficient condition for f to be Riemann integrable on AB. So suppose that f is integrable on AC and CB both separately and simultaneously. So there exist dissections D1 and D2 on AC and CB respectively, such that both UFD1 minus LFD1 and UFD2 minus LFD2 are less than epsilon on 2. Finally, the union of D1 and D2, which is set to D, is a dissection of AB, and calculating the upper and lower sums with respect to this dissection, we have that UFD minus LFD equals UFD1 plus UFD2 minus LFD1 plus LFD2, which equals UFD1 minus LFD1 plus UFD2 minus LFD2. Both the first two and last two terms are together less than epsilon on 2, yielding an overall sum of epsilon. Hence f is Riemann integrable on AB, completing the second half of the proof of this equivalence. To prove the equation, suppose that any one of the conditions hold. The key idea is to create a bound on the following quantity, namely the difference between the integral of f over AB and the sums of the integrals of f over AC and CB. To do this, choose D1 and D2 as in the proof of the reverse direction of the equivalence. Remember that D1 and D2 are dissections of these subintervals AC and CB respectively and not AB. Now the integral of f over AB minus LFD is non-negative and at the same time bounded above by UFD minus LFD, where D was defined to be D1 union D2. The difference between upper and lower sums here was strictly less than epsilon. Rearranging the inequality, we find that the integral of f over AB is less than LFD plus epsilon. This relation is labelled with an asterisk. Simultaneously, the difference UFD minus the integral of f over AB is non-negative and bounded above by the difference between the upper and lower sums of f computed with respect to D, which is in turn less than epsilon just as before. The implication is that the integral of f over AB is greater than UFD minus epsilon, a relation that we label with star. On combining the dual inequalities asterisk and star, we arrive at the relation delta 1, that the integral of f over AB is greater than u of d minus epsilon and at the same time less than L of d plus epsilon. Similar, such relations 1 and 2 are obtained for the integrals of f over AC and CB. Combining 1 and 2 yields delta 2, that the sum of the integrals of f over AC and CB is greater than u of d minus epsilon and less than L of d plus epsilon. Here the identity that u of d equals the sum of the terms u of d1 and u of d2 and L of d equals L of d1 plus L of d2 have been used. Finally, subtracting delta 1 from delta 2, we arrive at u of d minus L of d minus 2 epsilon is less than the integral of f over AB minus the sum of the integrals of f over AC and CB, which is in turn less than 2 epsilon minus u of d minus L of d. And since u of d minus L of d is non-negative, it follows that the weaker inequality that the combination of the integrals is greater than negative 2 epsilon and less than positive 2 epsilon holds. And since this is valid for all positive epsilon, the implication is that the combination of integrals is in fact not. In other words, the result of additivity does indeed hold. For the next piece of notation, we are going to use the shorthand f less than or equal to g to denote that g exceeds or equals f on the entire interval AB. Here f and g are real valued functions. The statement of theorem 25, also known as monotonicity, says that if f and g are two real valued integrable functions in AB, then the integral of f is less than or equal to the integral of g is a necessary condition for us to have f less than or equal to g on the domain AB. As a brief remark, the reason this property is referred to as monotonicity is that if the integral is thought of as a map from the set of integrable functions in AB to the set of real numbers, and element a from the domain, in this case the function g, is larger than element b, in this case the function f, then the image of element a in the real numbers is larger than the image of b in the real numbers, which simply rehashes the statement that the integral of g is larger than or equal to the integral of f. The particular caveat in this case is what it means for one function to be less than another. Certainly not all integrable functions can be compared using the definition given, since for arbitrarily chosen f and g, both f less than or equal to g and g less than or equal to f may fail to hold simultaneously, a phenomenon that we do not observe with the reals, since for real x and y, we always have either x less than or equal to y or y less than or equal to x. For the proof of monotonicity, take an arbitrary dissection D of AB, label with capital Ri and Si the suprema of f and g over each subinterval respectively. Then u of d, which is the sum of capital Ri times delta xi, is less than or equal to the sum of capital Si times delta xi, which is defined to be the upper sum of g with respect to d. As this is true for all dissections D, it means that the upper integral of f over AB is less than or equal to the upper integral of g over AB. But by hypothesis, f and g are Riemann integrable, which is another way of saying that the upper integrals of f and g are the integrals of f and g themselves. Hence, the integral of g minus the integral of f is non-negative and the result follows. Some of the coming theorems deal with the algebraic properties of the class of integrable functions on a closed bounded interval AB. The first such theorem states that this set RAB is endowed with a special structure, that of a vector space over the field of real numbers. So suppose that f and g are two Riemann integrable functions and k in R is a scalar. Then both f plus g and kf lie in RAB. In other words, the set of Riemann integrable functions is closed under addition and scalar multiplication. Furthermore, for the same f and g and scalar k, the integral over AB of kf plus g equals k times the integral of f over AB plus the integral of g over AB. Using the language of linear algebra, one says that the integral defines a linear functional on the space of Riemann integrable functions RAB into the scalar field R. In providing the proof of this fact, we need a lemma to smooth the way. So let D be a dissection of AB, then the upper sum of f plus g with respect to D is less than or equal to the upper sum of f with respect to D plus the upper sum of g with respect to D. Similarly, LF plus g comma D is greater than or equal to LFD plus LGD. For the proof of the lemma, choose the dissection D in question and introduce the following notation. Capital Ri, Si and Ti denote the suprema of fg and f plus g over each of the subintervals x sub I minus 1 to x sub I and little ri, si and ti denote the infima of f, g and f plus g over each of the subintervals. First, notice that capital Ti is less than or equal to capital Ri plus capital Si, and little ti is greater than or equal to little ri plus little si. From this it follows that u f plus g comma d, which equals the sum of capital Ti delta xi, is less than or equal to the sum of capital Ri plus si times delta xi. Breaking this into the two sums of capital Ri delta xi and capital Si delta xi gives ufd plus ugd, proving the first inequality of the lemma. For the second inequality, the lower sum L f plus g comma d, defined to be the sum of little ti delta xi, is greater than or equal to little ri plus si delta xi, which in turn is broken into the sums of ri delta xi and si delta xi, which in turn are equal to lfd plus lgd, proving the second inequality of the lemma. Now we move on to the proof of the theorem. Since f and g are Riemann integrable by hypothesis, we can, by forming unions of dissections if required, arrange for d in calligraphic d of ab to be such that the difference between the upper and lower sums of f and g with respect to d are each less than epsilon upon 2. Proceeding, we observe that with d chosen in this way, the difference between the upper and lower sums of f plus g when computed with respect to d is not more than ufd plus ugd minus lfd plus lgd. Rearranging the right hand side, we see that this is identical to the sum of the difference between the upper and lower sums of f and the upper and lower sums of g, all evaluated with respect to d. This in turn is less than epsilon over 2 plus epsilon over 2, which equals epsilon, leading to the conclusion that f plus g is Riemann integrable, and so RAB is closed under addition. Now utilize the same dissection used to prove that RAB is closed under addition. The difference between the integral of f plus g over ab and the sum of the integral of f and the integral of g over ab is bounded above by f plus g comma d minus lfd plus lgd, which in turn is less than the upper sum of f plus the upper sum of g minus the sum of the lower sums of f and the lower sum of g, all calculated with respect to d. Rearranging again, we get that this equals ufd minus lfd plus ugd minus lgd, again less than 2 lots of epsilon over 2, just as before, which sum to epsilon. This relation we label with an asterisk, just like in one of the previous proofs. You may guess that we will develop a second inequality of the same form, which we shall label with a star, and you are correct. We now bound this difference in integrals from below. First, we note that it is greater than or equal to lf plus g comma d minus ufd plus ugd. This is in turn greater than or equal to lfd plus lgd minus ufd plus ugd. Rearranging and factoring out a negative sign, this equals the negative of the quantity ufd minus lfd plus ugd minus lgd, which is strictly greater than negative 2 lots of epsilon over 2 that sum to negative epsilon. This is relation star, namely the integral of f plus g over ab minus the integral of f over ab plus the integral of g over ab is greater than negative epsilon. And much like in the proof of additivity, combining asterisk and star gives that the difference of integrals is bounded above by positive epsilon and bounded below by negative epsilon, where this relation holds true for all positive epsilon, implying that the difference between the integral of f plus g and the sum of the integrals of f and g vanishes, thus proving that integrals of sums are sums of integrals. For the second part, we prove that for a positive constant k, kf lies in RAB no matter what f is, as long as f is Riemann integrable. The case of k equals 0 is trivial, and the case of k negative is left as an exercise. Now, because k is a positive constant and f is Riemann integrable, it follows that we can choose a dissection d of AB such that ufd minus lfd is less than epsilon over k. Moreover, the suprema and infima of kf over each subinterval is k times the suprema and infima of f over each subinterval respectively. The suprema of kf equals k times capital Ti and the infima of kf equals k times little ti for every subinterval. For the same dissection that has been chosen, the difference between the upper and lower sums of kf equals the sum of k times capital Ti minus little ti times the length of each subinterval delta xi Factoring out the positive constant k from the sum, we have this equals k times the difference between the upper and lower sums when computed with respect to d, which is less than epsilon over k by design. The product of the two terms then yields epsilon. Ergo, RAB is closed under multiplication by a positive constant. The same can be said for k equals 0 and k negative. Now that we know that kf lies in RAB and is Riemann integrable, it makes sense to ask what the integral of kf is with respect to the integral of f. This question is readily settled for k equals 0, whence it is shown that the integral of kf equals 0. So let k be positive, then invariant of the dissection d that we choose, the upper sum of kf equals k times the upper sum of f. The first quantity is, by definition, the sum of k times capital Ti times delta xi. Pulling out the k from the sum, we notice that the sum of capital Ti delta xi is equivalent to the upper sum of f with respect to d. Moving onwards, we recall that the infimum of the upper sums gives us the value of the integral for all integrable functions. Hence, the integral of kf over ab is identical to the infimum of the upper sums of kf as d ranges through all possible dissections of ab. From the previous slide, we know that for a fixed dissection d, the equality ukf, d equals k times ufd holds. The constant k is positive and hence is order preserving and does not reverse the order like a negative constant would. Therefore, it is valid to factor out the k from the infimum and conclude that the infimum of ku is k times the infimum of u. Finally, remembering the fact that the hypothesis assumes that f is Riemann integrable, we write that the infimum of ufd is the integral of f over ab. So for positive k, this proves that the integral of kf is k times the integral of f. To show that the same holds for negative k, set k equal to negative L, where L is a positive constant. Then k is negative and the function L plus k times f is identically 0 on the interval ab. So the integral of the function L plus kf over ab is 0. Moreover, from the first part of the same theorem, we know that the integral of sums is the sum of integrals. Therefore, the integral of L plus k times f is the sum of the integral of Lf and the integral of kf. Furthermore, L positive means that we can factor out L out of the integral and leave the expression unaltered. So 0 equals L times the integral of f plus the integral of kf. Adding the additive inverse of the first term to both sides, we conclude that the integral of kf over ab equals negative L times the integral of f over ab. And since k equals negative L, the proof is complete and the assertion holds for all k in the reals. An algebraic structure closely related to a vector space is something known as an algebra. More precisely, a vector space is a larger class of objects of which algebras form a smaller and more special subset. That is, every algebra is a vector space, but for a vector space to be an algebra, one needs a stronger property than simply closure and addition and scalar multiplication. One needs the vector space to have defined on it a product between vectors that yields a third vector. This operation of multiplication must satisfy the distributive laws with respect to addition of vectors and must also be compatible with scalar multiplication. Ordinary multiplication of functions satisfies this property. We now prove that the vector space RAB is in fact an algebra. In other words, whenever two functions that are Riemann integrable are multiplied together, then the product is also Riemann integrable. To begin, we first start with some notation. If f from ab to r is a real valued function, then we denote by mod f the function from ab to r that maps every x in ab to the modulus of f of x. This brings us to theorem 29, also known as the triangle inequality of integration. As has been the trend, this theorem comes in two parts as well. The first part is a one-way implication stating that if f is Riemann integrable, then so is the function modulus of f. The second part provides an inequality relating the integrals of f and the modulus of f. In particular, the modulus of the integral of f over ab is less than or equal to the integral of the modulus of f over ab. For the proof, place capital Ri to be equal to the supremum of mod f over each subinterval and little ri to be the infimum of mod f over each subinterval. Then in each subinterval of the form x sub I minus 1 to x sub I, choose arbitrary x and y. It then follows that the difference between the images of x and y under mod f defined to be mod f of x minus mod f of y, is less than or equal to the modulus of f of x minus f of y by the second form of the triangle inequality for real numbers. This inequality is in turn less than or equal to capital Ti minus little ti. This is since the modulus of the gap between the images of x and y under f cannot be greater than the difference between the supremum and the infimum of f in each subinterval. Rearranging the established inequality and keeping y fixed, we observe that mod f of x is less than or equal to capital Ti minus little ti plus mod f of y. This being true for all x and y in x sub I minus 1 to x sub I. Hence the supremum of mod f in the same subinterval should also be bounded above by the same quantity, namely capital Ti minus little ti plus mod f of y. Finally, we can now relax the condition that y is fixed and realize that since y was chosen arbitrarily from the subinterval, the inequality holds for y too. So the modulus of f of y is greater than or equal to capital Ri minus capital Ti plus little ti, implying that the infimum of mod f must be bounded below by the same quantity. We hence conclude that little ri is greater than or equal to capital Ri minus capital Ti plus little ti. With one final rearrangement of the inequality, we learn that capital Ri minus little ri is bounded above by capital Ti minus little ti. Proceeding, we notice that a dissection D can be found such that u of d minus L of d is less than epsilon, since f is assumed to be Riemann integrable. For the same dissection D, the difference between the upper and lower sums of the modulus of f, given by the sum of capital Ri minus little ri times delta xi, is less than or equal to the sum of capital Ti minus little ti times delta xi, which is by definition the difference between the upper and lower sums of f computed with respect to d. This final quantity is strictly less than epsilon, thus completing the proof that even the modulus of f is Riemann integrable. In proving the inequality itself, we fall back on one of the previous theorems we proved a short while ago, monotonicity. It is known that both f and negative f are less than or equal to the function mod f on the entire closed interval ab. Applying the principle of monotonicity of the integral, we arrive at the result that the integral of f over ab is less than or equal to the integral of the modulus of f over ab, and also the integral of the function negative f over the interval ab is less than or equal to the integral of the modulus of f over ab. Putting these two results together and using the linearity of the integral, we have that the integral of f over ab is less than or equal to the integral of mod f over ab and greater than or equal to the negative of the integral of mod f over the same interval. This simply entails that the modulus of the integral of f is less than the integral of the modulus of f over ab, hence proving the desired inequality. Remember that such a step is indeed justified since the integral of the modulus of f over ab is a non-negative quantity. The next theorem we prove is that the square of a Riemann integrable function is also Riemann integrable. To achieve this end, we need some more notation. Let f from ab to r be a real valued function, then the function f squared from ab to r is defined by f squared of x equals f of x all squared for each x in the domain ab. Note that by f squared we do not mean the function formed by the composition of f with itself, commonly used notation in algebra. The purpose of introducing this notation was to more easily communicate the content of theorem 31, which is summarized neatly in the following one-way implication, namely f in RAB is a sufficient condition for f squared to be in RAB as well. To begin the proof, we can assume without loss of generality that the function f is non-negative throughout its domain. The reason for this is that f squared is identical to the square of the modulus of f, and we know by the first half of theorem 29, namely the triangle inequality of integration, that if f is Riemann integrable, then so is the modulus of f. So it stands to reason that even if f is not non-negative on its entire domain, then at least the modulus of f is surely non-negative on its entire domain. Furthermore, we can also assume that f is not identically 0 on its entire domain, for otherwise the proof that f squared is integrable is trivial. So to summarize, f is non-negative on the domain AB and attains at least one positive value in this domain. One consequence of this assumption is that the supremum of f over the entire interval AB, which we set to be equal to capital T, is a strictly positive quantity. Therefore, we can find a dissection of AB such that the difference between the upper and lower sums of f when calculated with respect to d is less than epsilon over 2t. Moreover, with the assumptions we have made, it is true that the supremum of f squared over each subinterval is capital Ti squared, and the infimum of f squared over each subinterval is the quantity little ti squared. Here we are using the earlier notation that capital Ti corresponds to the supremum of f over each subinterval and little ti corresponds to the infimum of f over each subinterval. When the difference between the upper and lower sums of f squared are computed with respect to this dissection d, we have the following. First, that it is equal to the sum of capital Ti squared minus little ti squared times delta xi. In the next line, we use the factorization for the difference of squares, i.e. capital Ti squared minus little ti squared equals the product of capital Ti plus little ti and capital Ti minus little ti. The quantity capital Ti plus little ti is bounded above by the quantity 2 times capital T, since the supremum of f over the entire interval AB is greater than the supremum, or for that matter the infimum of f over any subinterval. Next, capital 2T is invariant of the index I, and hence it is factored out of the summand. The sum of capital Ti minus little ti delta xi is again recognized as the difference between the upper and lower sums of f computed with respect to d, and by design this quantity is less than epsilon over 2t. The net effect is that the difference between the upper and lower sums of f squared computed with respect to d is less than epsilon. Hence the function f squared is also Riemann integrable. The next piece of notation deals with the product of two functions f and g, where f and g are real valued and have as their domains the closed bounded interval ab. We use the function fg to denote the product function of f and g, i.e. fg of x equals f of x times g of x for all x in the domain AB. Following on from theorem 31, we have corollary 33, namely that integrable functions form an algebra, which in simple terms is the statement that the space RAB is closed under the multiplication of integrable functions. Formally, let f and g be two Riemann integrable real valued functions defined on AB, then the product function fg is also Riemann integrable on the domain AB. The proof of this is surprisingly quick using the result of theorem 31, as is generally the case with many corollaries following on from larger and more complicated theorems. The observation that completes the proof is that the function fg can be written as a quarter of the difference between the functions f plus g squared and f minus g squared, along with the fact that this latter expression is Riemann integrable. RAB is closed under addition of functions and scalar multiplication, and so the functions f plus g and f minus g are Riemann integrable. Moreover, f plus g all squared and f minus g all squared are also Riemann integrable as a consequence of theorem 31. Finally, the entire expression is simply a linear combination of the functions f plus g squared and f minus g squared, and so by virtue of theorem 26 is also Riemann integrable. It should be remarked that the motivation for calling a vector space that is closed under multiplication of its vectors as an algebra goes as follows, where we make particular reference to the space RAB. If f1 up to fn is a collection of functions that are Riemann integrable over AB, then any polynomial expression written by using the functions f1 up to fn as the variables is also Riemann integrable. With this remark being made, we come to the end of this section on the rules of integration and enter our final section on the fundamental theorem of calculus and its proof. We commence our journey with a lemma. Let f from AB to R be a Riemann integrable function. Put capital T to be the supremum of the image of f over the entire interval AB and little t to be the infimum of the image of f over the interval AB. Then it follows that the integral of f over AB is bounded above by the quantity capital T times b minus a and bounded below by the quantity little t times b minus a. For the proof, note that regardless of the dissection of AB that is chosen, we always have the two inequalities capital T greater than or equal to capital Ti and little t smaller than or equal to little ti for every index I. So if D is an arbitrary dissection, then the integral of f over AB is less than or equal to the upper sum of f with respect to D, which equals the sum of the quantity capital Ti times delta xi. This is in turn less than or equal to the sum of the quantity capital T times delta xi. When the capital T is factored out of the sum, the quantity inside simplifies to b minus a, since the sum of all the subintervals equals the length of the entire interval ab. This establishes the proof of the upper bound, namely that the integral of f over ab is less than or equal to the product of capital T and b minus a. The proof for the lower bound is analogous. The next lemma we require in our quest to prove the fundamental theorem of calculus is the intermediate value theorem, one of the central results in the application of real analysis to continuous functions on closed bounded domains. So for our hypotheses, let us suppose that f from ab to r is a continuous real valued function, then set alpha to be the infimum of f over the interval ab and beta to be the supremum of f over the interval ab. The intermediate value theorem then asserts that for all y in the interval alpha beta, there exists x in AB such that f of x equals y. Lemma 35 enables us to establish theorem 36, the mean value theorem of integral calculus. Again, we suppose that f from AB to R is continuous and real valued. Note the importance of this assumption. The mean value theorem of integral calculus fails to hold if f is not continuous. If f is continuous, then there exists a point C in the interval AB such that the integral of f over AB is equal to the quantity f of C times the length of the interval b minus a. Since f is presumed to be a continuous function, it satisfies the conditions of the intermediate value theorem. Following the same notational conventions as before, little t equals alpha, which was defined to be the infimum of f over AB, and beta equals capital T, which equals the supremum of f over AB. Moreover, f is Riemann integrable on AB as it is continuous on the same interval. So by lemma 34, we have that the integral of f over the interval AB is bounded above by capital T times b minus a and bounded below by little t times b minus a. Dividing by b minus a, we obtain that little t is less than the integral of f over ab divided by b minus a, which in turn is less than or equal to capital T. What this implies is that the quantity 1 over b minus a times the integral of f over ab lies in the closed bounded interval from little t to capital T, or equivalently from alpha to beta. Hence, there exists a C in the closed interval AB such that f of C equals 1 over b minus a times the integral of f over AB by the intermediate value theorem. Rearranging, we get that for this C, the integral of f over AB equals f of C times b minus a, and the result is proven. Since the fundamental theorem of calculus ties together integration and differentiation, it is necessary for us to take a short detour and review the idea of differentiability. So let capital F from AB to R be a real valued function. Then choose gamma in the open interval AB. We say that f is differentiable at gamma if the limit of the differential quotient as h tends to naught exists in R. More precisely, the differential quotient is the quantity f of gamma plus h minus f of gamma all divided by h. If capital F is differentiable at every point in the open interval AB and has a right derivative at A and a left derivative at B, then f is said to be differentiable on the closed interval AB. Finally, we define capital F, the star of the fundamental theorem of calculus, to be the signed area under the curve of little f. So let little f from AB to R be a continuous real valued function. Then choose gamma in the half open interval AB, that is excluding A but including B. The restriction of f to the closed domain A gamma is continuous and hence Riemann integrable. So define the function capital F from AB to R by the following rule. Capital F of A equals 0, and for gamma in the half open interval AB, define capital F of gamma to be the integral of little f from A to gamma. With capital F having been defined in this way, we now state theorem 39, i.e. the fundamental theorem of calculus. It states simply that the function capital F is differentiable on the closed interval AB and f prime of gamma equals little f of gamma for all gamma in AB. Now we come to the proof. At A and B we need to consider the right and left derivatives of AB respectively. So we leave these points as an exercise. We prove the claim for all gamma in the open interval AB. Since gamma lies in the open interval AB, we can choose h in the reals such that the modulus of h is small enough and gamma plus h lies in the open interval a plus b too. From this it follows that capital F of gamma plus h minus capital F of gamma equals the integral of f over the interval from a to gamma plus h minus the integral of f over the interval from a to gamma. This difference is the integral of f from gamma to gamma plus h, which follows from additivity of the integral. This in fact holds even for negative h, using the convention that if the upper bound of an integral is swapped with its lower bound, then the integral picks up a negative sign. So when h is not 0, the differential quotient f of gamma plus h minus f of gamma all over h equals 1 over h times the integral of f over the interval from gamma to gamma plus h. Now depending on whether h is positive or negative, there exists a theta in the closed interval gamma comma gamma plus h or gamma plus h comma gamma, such that f of theta equals 1 over h times the integral of f over the interval gamma to gamma plus h. This conclusion follows on from theorem 37, the mean value theorem of integral calculus. So the equality f of gamma plus h minus f of gamma over h equals f of theta holds for all non-zero h that are small enough in absolute value. Finally, as h tends to 0, gamma plus h tends to gamma, and since theta is sandwiched in between gamma and gamma plus h, it follows that theta tends to gamma as well. When the limit as h tends to 0 is taken on the left hand side, we obtain the derivative of capital F evaluated at gamma, and from the right hand side we see that this equals the quantity little f of gamma. Moreover, gamma was chosen arbitrarily, and so this equality holds for all gamma in the open interval AB, thus concluding the proof. A comprehensive text on the subject matter and a gold mine for further reading and references is the book on real analysis by the late Scottish mathematician John M. Howie and published by Springer. Dr. John M. Howie uses simple and clear explanations to make the content of real analysis easily accessible to undergraduate students, and this book, one of many authored by him, is a must read. And on that note, we bring this video to a close. I thank you for watching through to the end, and I hope you gained some valuable insights into the analytical theory of the Riemann integral. So I sign out for now and hope to see you in a future video.